Well, thank you very much, Richard, and it's great to be here with you this morning on what is I'm sure will be a fascinating event that Richard and his team have put together. We're, as the CEC Group, we've been proud to have supported these events over the years. CEC Group is a major independent political consultancy operating throughout Central Europe, assisting foreign investors, foreign multinationals in their maneuvering, as it were, through the legislative, regulatory, political, and policy processes in the region, which are so important for making investment and business decisions across a range of sectors, including the real estate market, which is particularly sensitive to the long-term, both the medium-term and the long-term economic and political prospects of markets. And the reason why I think it's great that we're meeting today so early in 2022 is that 2022 promises to be, or perhaps promise is not maybe quite the right word. There's a warning that the Central Europe may be an area of Europe where the various forces acting on the region will cause a new dynamic which will be political, which will be economic, and which will be social. So it's really a crucial year for the region. So I think the first important vector, if you want to use that word, impacting the region is the United States. The United States, and this is the first change. We've seen already that change happening over the course of last year, of 2021, after the presidential elections. Now, remember, under the presidency of Donald Trump, the United States was pursuing almost a dual track policy towards Europe and towards Central Europe. One track was to focus very much on Central Europe as a region. Donald Trump was very much in favor of the 3 Cs initiative, which I'll come back to later. But he was also interested in forming deep bilateral relationships with specific European Union countries at the expense of others. And the best examples of that are obviously Poland, or were Poland and Hungary. Trump had a particular ideological and political affinity for those countries, as we know. And he was interested in developing that bilateral relationship to, as it were, move around the institutional framework through which historically US presidents have operated, primarily NATO and the European Union in Brussels, driven by his suspicions and caution towards a deeper bilateral relationship between the United States on the one hand and Germany and France on the other. Now, under the Biden administration, that has all changed, or at least that was the idea that it would change last year. When the Biden administration came in, Joe Biden had a couple of 2 or 3, together with his team at the State Department, Antony Blinken there, moving into the position held previously by Mike Pompeo, had a very clear view of what they wanted to achieve in Europe and in relation to Central Europe. On the one hand, they wanted to resuscitate institutions. They wanted to start working again through the European Union directly with Brussels. They wanted to reinvigorate NATO, and that meant reestablishing a direct and good relationships with Brussels on the one hand and Germany and France on the other. And that meant perhaps removing Poland in particular, and Hungary especially, from the sense that they had a privileged relationship with the United States. Now, the second factor that came into play was that the Biden administration and the Blinken State Department have started to place a great deal of stress on things like human rights, rule of law, media freedom issues, and also a vague sense of cultural issues, which talked about things like gender identity, LGBT rights, and other national minority rights, and so on. All of which of those issues were not that important for the Trump administration. And that was the second factor which led to Poland and Hungary, and initially Czech Republic and 1 or 2 other countries in the region, to be put on what you might call a second tier of relationships with the United States. That was reflected in the fact that for a long time, in the case of Poland, President Biden did not interact directly with the Polish administration. either with Prime Minister Morawiecki or with President Duda. It took a long time for phone calls between the two heads of state to occur. And there was also a clear cooling off at the level of the State Department. Poland, after the departure of Georgette Mosbacher, who was Trump's political appointee from Poland at the beginning of 2021, no ambassador for over a year. So what that picture really shows is that Central Europe, for a while, stopped being the priority of the US administration. The focus was very much on bringing together the US relationship with Brussels, with Berlin, rebuilding a fractured relationship with Angela Merkel while she was still chancellor, obviously with President Macron there as well. Now, over the last couple of months, primarily because of the increasingly obvious Russia crisis on the eastern flank of NATO, we've seen the US administration in recent weeks and months, certainly towards the end of 2021, repivoting back towards Central Europe, recognizing that in the face of a resurgent Russia and the Ukraine crisis, that the requirement for a very strong primary defense relationship with Central Europe remains an absolute priority. And we've seen the US administration working hard to re-establish its credibility in the eyes of Central Europe, both as a strong NATO partner, but also in a bilateral relationship in terms of defense sales, particularly into Poland, Slovakia, and Romania and other frontline states. So trying to, as it were, separate out all those difficult issues that Central Europe is facing in its relationship with the United States. But as I said, in many cases over things like rule of law and media freedom issues being put to one side, and a refocus on a re-cementing of that relationship on the defense and security side. That's not to say that the US administration, the Blinken State Department, have forgotten about those difficult issues, but obviously in the light of the Russia crisis, they've been parked. And Poland in particular, encouraged by the fact that the US administration moved relatively quickly to appoint a new ambassador who arrived in Poland last Friday, the 21st of January, Mark Brzezinski, who is the son of the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor back in the late 70s, and the brother of the well-known analyst Ian Brzezinski in a very well-known media family in the United States. Mark Brzezinski being seen as a very important player now in Warsaw, as I said, trying to work together to rebuild that confidence of that relationship between the United States and Poland. And we've seen similar moves with the State Department in relation to other Central European countries. So that is one important, as I say, shifting vector of influence on the region. Obviously now that renewed confidence of the United States administration in Central Europe reflected in other areas, not just defense, but also energy. We've seen a very strong support by the US administration for nuclear programs in the Czech Republic and in Poland, and obviously continued support for strong US investment in the region. And I'm sure we'll see more of that next year as well. So on the economic front, on the security front, a lot of progress in the US relationship, but also some hesitancy because of what I say, rule of law, media freedom, and cultural issues. Now, that's one set of vectors. Now, I've already mentioned Russia, and that is really the absolute new driver of what is going on in Central Europe today. Remember, Central Europe's history of the last 30 years has really been about getting away from the orbit of Russia and moving back into a strategic position with the West in terms of institutional membership, primarily of NATO and the European Union. And Russia's potential aggression against Ukraine, or actually continued aggression given their previous invasions that they've masterminded in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, are really designed not just to subordinate Ukraine as an independent sovereign state and perhaps establish a rump state which would be run by a puppet regime beholden to Moscow. That's one part of their strategic goal, clearly. But the other strategic goal, this is one where the Central Europeans are particularly worried about, is an attempt by Moscow to reverse the progress that those countries have made over the last 30 years in terms of their integration with the West, to try and separate out or create almost a second-tier membership of NATO in relation to those former satellite states like Poland and Romania, or former Soviet republics like the Baltic states, and trying to exert pressure on NATO to either withdraw armaments or reduce their security guarantees to the region. That's totally unacceptable to Central Europe, and something that is not going to happen. But what Russia is trying to do is to exercise new soft power into the region, whether it's through energy, using the potential Nord Stream 2 pipeline as an instrument of energy blackmail towards Central Europe and indeed Germany itself, whether it's through cyber attacks, whether it's through propaganda warfare, using various soft power mechanisms to try and create and foment division within the political elites and between the elites and societies of Central Europe as a way of cleaving out this region away from its historical refocus towards NATO and Brussels and the European Union. Now, the third vector of influence is, of course, the European Union. I've touched on that already in saying that the Ukraine challenge, the Russia challenge, is a great test of European Union intentions. Now, the Russia crisis, to a large extent, caught most people by surprise. We saw tensions mounting, but nobody towards the second half of last year was not really expecting Putin to step up his preparations for a potential invasion to the extent that he has. And the European Union was also unprepared for this. And we already saw last year a fairly strong shift within the European Union towards the way they treated a number of Central European countries. And here I'm going to focus primarily on Poland and Hungary, where over the last year, we saw an increasing consensus within Brussels and within the Commission, and also amongst other major European players, primarily Germany and France, about how the Commission and how the European Union should respond to what the European Union were viewing as transgressions by Poland, Hungary, one or two other countries. Bulgaria is another Eastern member of the European Union that's on the naughty step from Brussels' perspective, on issues such as rule of law, media freedoms, LGBT rights, abortion rights, policy towards migration, a range of issues which had been festering for a number of years in the eyes of Brussels, but were coming to a head during the course of last year. But we've seen the European Union increasingly linking progress, or what it sees as progress in Central Europe on all those difficult issues, with cash transfers, particularly on the European Recovery Plan and also on the 2020 European financial perspective, linking progress made by Central European countries on these cases with the passing to Central Europe of these very considerable numbers of transfer funds that are actually due to Central Europe. And this week, we will be seeing a very important judgment by the European Court of Justice on the legality of this conditionality of linking transfer payments to Central Europe with progress on rule of law issues. And that'll be a crucial judgment, because depending on which way that judgment goes, it will drive the dynamic of the relationship between Central Europe and Brussels to a large extent in 2022. Just very finally on the European Union and these two countries in particular, Hungarian elections coming up on April the 3rd this year. Very strong efforts being made by the opposition in uniting around a common electoral list to defeat Viktor Orban's Fidesz party. I was in Budapest a couple of weeks ago, and the mood within the ruling camp is increasingly optimistic that they will win those elections, mainly due to the very poor campaign, relatively speaking, which is being run by the opposition. But nonetheless, if Viktor Orban does win those elections, that will be a problem for Brussels, because, yes, you can threaten Viktor Orban with conditionality of EU payments for a few months, but can you do that for another 4 years? In other words, can the European Union afford to have a permanent awkward squad on its eastern flank at a crucial moment of tension with Russia further to the east? Is this a sustainable policy of the Commission and the EU? A lot will be driven by what is going on in Germany. The new German government, led by Olaf Scholz, has a slightly different view on Central Europe than Mrs. Merkel. Mrs. Merkel, although she was critical of countries like Poland and Hungary, she really did put a primacy on EU unity. And on the margins of conflicts, she always tried to temper them to ensure that there would not be a crunch divorce with Central Europe. The new German government, Olaf Scholz and his foreign minister from the Green Party, have a much more robust attitude towards Central Europe, and they could be much less like Merkel in their ability to or desire to work with Central Europe. And of course, the big test for Germany in the eyes of Poland is going to be to what extent the new German government does or does not recognize that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that's being constructed with Russia is a threat to national security of Central Europe and Ukraine. And they'll be looking to Berlin to see if they follow through on their promise to either shut down or not permit the pipeline to start functioning as long as there is a threat of Russia to Ukrainian independence. I'll conclude by really talking about the fourth area of pressure on Central Europe, which is, within Central Europe itself, funny enough. I've already mentioned the tension between Poland and the Czech Republic over the Turów pipeline. And what we've seen over the last year, certainly, is an erosion of many of the institutions that were holding together Central Europe as a unity. The Visegrad Group, in particular, for over 30 years, was seen as a real vehicle of collaboration between Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary. That is now not so much seen as the V4, but now seen as the V2+2. You've got Hungary and Poland on the one hand with a very different set of issues and agendas in relation to Brussels, in contrast to Czech Republic and Slovakia, who in different ways are improving and strengthening their position and relationship with Brussels. And funny enough, you even have elements of tension between Poland and Hungary, particularly over the attitude and policy stance towards energy issues, Russia. The other institutions that traditionally the Central Europeans have been looking to, whether it's the Bucharest Nine in the framework of NATO, that's strengthening. The big question mark is over the future of the 3Cs initiative. This has always been a flagship program driven primarily by the Poles and the Croats to establish a functioning financial framework for investments in infrastructure projects, energy projects, digital projects in the region. We'll see how much dynamic there is in that relationship. There is a summit coming up in June of this year in Riga, but with a lack of really strong funding coming in and a cooling to a large extent by the Biden administration. Remember, the Trump administration was very pro the 3Cs initiative. The Biden administration really not focusing on it so much as the Trump administration goes. We will see exactly where that 3Cs initiative ends up. Overarching all of this, of course, is things that no Central European government can ultimately control is COVID-19. These countries are moving out of the worst phase of the crises at different rates. Different countries have different successes. Poland in particular is a worry. The low level of testing, the low level of vaccinations make Poland particularly vulnerable to the viral shock. And we'll see what the Omicron variant does to Poland over the next few months. But as I say, just in conclusion, all of I've been saying is going to be really overshadowed by what happens in Ukraine. In a worst case scenario of a full-on Russia invasion, this will have major political consequences, but also economic consequences. Remember, not all of these countries are in the euro. Poland has the zloty, Hungary has got the forint. What will happen to those currencies if there's a war on their eastern doorstep? Will that result in a a decline in value will that result in problems? Inflationary pressures are increasing in some of these countries. The worst thing that might happen is a social problem of mass migration of Ukrainian war refugees, literally knocking at the doors of Central Europe, with the biggest door being the Polish border as well as the Hungarian border, and we'll see what happens there. So just to conclude, thank you very much for your attention. I hope that I haven't depressed you too much, but unlike last year when I was here, things are much more uncertain, and there are much more prospects for instability in Central Europe, much greater flux, mainly due to these new pressures coming in from the east, from Brussels, from a question mark of how the US relationship will develop, and a fragmentation of those alliances and relationships within Central Europe that had in the past held these countries together. So a much more uncertain time. But one thing that history has shown us, this region and these countries are incredibly resilient. Their desire for freedom, their desire for independence, their desire to be part of the West is unsurmountable. If 50 years of communism couldn't destroy that, a couple of years of Mr. Putin won't either. So in the very long term, this part of the world you have to be optimistic about this region just because of the spirit that's here. In the short term, we'll have to put our seatbelts on and keep our fingers firmly crossed. Thank you very much for your attention.